Have you ever had a bad review at work? Well, don't worry, it happens to the best of us. And if you are a writer, it almost was certainly other writers who were doing the criticising, and here are some of the best. Legendary beatnik writer Jack Kerouac impressed an entire generation of youngsters. But Truman Capote was not impressed, writing, "None of these people in the Beat generation have anything interesting to say, and none of them can write, not even Mr. Kerouac. It's not writing, it's typing." Or how about Norman Mailer, who wrote, "His rhythms are erratic, his sense of character is nil, he is as pretentious as a rich whore, sentimental as a lollipop." But Truman Capote also had his critics, such as Gore Vidal, who wrote, "He's a fully fledged housewife from Kansas with all the prejudices." And what about what Virginia Woolf had to say about Jane Austen? Anyone who has the temerity to write about Jane Austen is aware of two facts. First, that of all the great writers, she is the most difficult to catch in an act of greatness. Second, that there are 25 elderly gentlemen living in the neighbourhood of London who resent any slight upon her genius as if it were an insult offered to the chastity of their aunts. And it gets worse. Mark Twain wrote, "Every time I read Pride and Prejudice, I want to dig her up and beat her over the skull with her own shin bone." And speaking of Mark Twain, William Faulkner said of Twain that he was a hack writer who would not have been considered fourth-rate in Europe, who tricked out a few of the old proven surefire literary skeletons with sufficient local colour to intrigue the superficial and the lazy. Whoo! Fuck! Vladimir Nabokov was not a fan of Ernest Hemingway, writing, "I read him for the first time in the early 40s. Something about bells, bulls and bulls. Ugh, I loathed it." Which is marginally nicer than what William Faulkner has to say, saying, "No courage, never been known to use a word which might send a reader to a dictionary." Ouch! Ouch! But not to worry, Hemingway wasn't going to take that lying down. And he fired back with, "Have you ever heard of anyone who drank while he worked?" You're thinking of Faulkner. He does sometimes. You can tell right in the middle of the page when he's had his first one. That's pretty big words coming from Hemingway, of all people. Edmund Wilson said of the novelist Evelyn Waugh, "His style has the desperate jauntiness of an orchestra fiddling away for dear life on a sinking ship." But then Waugh could be equally as nasty, once saying this about Proust. "I'm reading Proust for the first time. Very poor stuff. I think he was mentally defective." And a lot of writers have had a lot of stuff to say about James Joyce, so if you ever struggled with him at A level, you're not on your own. How about this from George Bernard Shaw? "Ulysses is a revolting record of a disgusting phase of civilization, but it is a truthful one. I should like to put a cordon around Dublin, round up every male person in it between the ages of 15 and 30, and force them to read it, and ask them whether, on reflection, they could see anything amusing in all that foul-mouthed, foul-minded derision and obscenity." Somebody's feeling a feeling there. Shall we take a moment to regulate ourselves, gentlemen? But it wasn't just the gentleman doing this. This is what Virginia Woolf had to say about James Joyce. "Ulysses is the work of a queasy undergraduate scratching his pimples." And Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, how could anyone possibly object? But they do, and it's Henry James, who writes, "To take Poe with more than a certain degree of seriousness is to lack seriousness oneself." And enthusiasm for Poe is a mark of a decidedly primitive stage of reflection. And how about this for a burn? Cyril Connolly wrote of George Orwell, "He could not blow his nose without moralising on the state of the handkerchief industry." And here's just a few more of my favourites. "Virginia Woolf's writing is no more than glamorous knitting. I believe she must have a pattern somewhere. Thank you very much, Dame Edith Sitwell." Robert Louis Stevenson described Walt Whitman as being like a large shaggy dog, just unchained, scouring the beaches of the world and baying at the moon. Agatha Christie isn't spared when Ruth Rendell writes, "To say that Agatha Christie's characters are cardboard cutouts is an insult to cardboard cutouts." Norman Mailer said, "I seem to be alone in finding him no more than the greatest mind ever to stay in prep school," about J.D. Salinger. And finally, Oscar Wilde said this about Charles Dickens, "You would have to have a heart of stone to read the death of Little Nell and not dissolve into tears of laughter." So if you've ever found yourself on the end of a very scathing review, don't worry. You are in very, very good company.